Joining us now is Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is a Guardian U.S. columnist, and he is the author, most recently, of The People, No, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. And by the way, he tackled the Wuhan lab leak story in a recent column for The Guardian titled, "If the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis is true, expect a political earthquake." Thomas Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
And it's my pleasure to be here. I was just looking at that picture of me on The Guardian. I was like, who is that handsome guy with that beautiful eye? I mean, that's me in a different era, not just a different decade. That's like a different century.
It's a nice picture. It's a nice picture, but sometimes you gotta hit up the publications you're working at, and maybe if you want an update, get an updated photo. But Thomas, this story, your piece, your opinion piece in The Guardian, I think is an important one because, first let's be upfront about, I think, an important fact here, which is we still do not know the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. So
correct.
The reason why this is a big story is because the Biden administration has tapped the State Department to consider investigating the possibility of a lab leak. So that's all we know so far. But
we know a lot more than that, but we don't know. There's no definitive answer like what actually caused the COVID pandemic, and it needs to be investigated. Obviously, there has to be accountability. Because we have to make sure something like this never happens again. This is the second global disaster. I used to always say when I would come on this show and on every other show, I would say that the great sort of defining event of our lifetimes is the financial crisis, in 2008 and 2009. And goddamn, this is worse. It's something even worse. And if it turns out to be something that it wasn't just a natural event, a new virus jumping from species to species, but in fact was sort of assisted on its way by humans, and then escaped from a lab or something like that. This is going to be so much bigger and worse than the financial crisis was.
So your article, I'm sorry, go on.
No, Jen, take it away.
Oh, I was just going to say your article sort of began by overviewing the findings from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which was sort of the big report that kind of got this conversation sort of swirling around. Can you kind of go over those findings? Because as Anna was saying, the lab leak theory, it's still improbable, right? But we have more questions now. So what did they find?
Yes, it is. Well, ordinarily, that would never be the answer, because we know where, viruses come from, where the seasonal flu every year, it's slightly different. It jumps from animals to humans. This is where almost all diseases come from, when there's a new disease. Now, I should just say two things before we get into this. First of all, I'm not an expert on that. What I do is history, that is specifically the history of ideas. And I am absolutely, this is in the sort of long, what would you say, the long history of how Americans deal with experts. This is an important sort of chapter in that history. But no, I'm not a biologist or virologist or anything like that. But in the social history of expertise, this is really fascinating. The other thing is, I want to point out, if we had had this conversation a month and a half ago, you wouldn't be allowed to put it on YouTube. And if you tried to tweet about it, your tweet would be deleted by an algorithm that knew that any talk like this was conspiracy theory. And that is what there are so many angles to this story that make it fascinating. And one of them is that conversations like this were actually censored not a very long time ago. And that is the world that we're living in now. Good old free speech America has become a place where certain ideas cannot be discussed, contemplated over social media. You can still talk about them on the phone, I guess, but not over social media. And that is bizarre by itself. And then there's also the traditional mass media, the sort of legacy news media, which was also, every time something like this came up, they would label it, false. The fact checkers had gone over this and determined that it was untrue, et cetera, et cetera. And just for, full disclosure, I believed all that stuff. I actually, 2 months ago, scolded member of my family, who's a Fox News viewer, Trump supporter, and I scolded him for believing this crap. I was like, come on, that's a conspiracy theory. And I'll be damned, now it looks like there might be some truth to it. And this, like I said, yes, a moral earthquake is on the way if this turns out to be true. But yeah, for me it began with I never took this seriously. Didn't really look into it. I like most people, I outsource what I know about the world to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and I believe what they said about this stuff. And then I happened to read that story in Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, not a right-wing publication, by the way. And it is a shocking story of exactly how plausible the lab leak hypothesis is. In the absence of, and I should point out before we get going on this, that like I said, most of the times when there's a new disease that sweeps over the world, it has leapt from animals to humans, and in this case, they can't find any evidence of that. There's a lot of speculation about it, but they haven't been able to find any trace of that yet.
This story is so difficult to navigate because of, I think, what the main theme of your piece is, this lack of trust in institutions. So, you write, I want to read an excerpt because this is certainly how I felt. It made perfect sense to us that Donald Trump, a politician we despised, could not grasp the situation that he suggested people inject bleach, and that he was personally responsible for more than one super spreading event. Reality itself punished leaders like him who refused to bow to expertise. So part of the reason why I just dismissed that theory from the get-go is because of the person it was coming from.
Of course.
And,
me too. Yeah. I mean,
so,
this guy's a nincompoop, anything he says, and a bigot. I mean, let's be honest about this. He is a bigot, and he was using this language in a bigoted way, and so I immediately distrusted it and said, this cannot be true, because this moron. Okay, that's a mean thing to say, because this guy, who I can't stand and who I think is a fool, it has embraced it. Now, there is a sense in which the whole COVID pandemic just fits so neatly into this kind of liberal worldview. You know what I'm talking about here? Those yard signs that I've been on this show making fun of them before. The yard signs that people have that say
in this house.
Yes, yeah. But there's another one that you often see. They in this house, it says science is real or something like that. And there's another one that you often see in your sort of affluent white collar neighborhoods that says respect science. And then there's this whole what would you say, discourse of the last 5 years that something terrible has happened in America, and that terrible thing is that we've lost faith in experts, but that is not the experts' fault. That's the fault of the people, and it's a sort of a mass, psychopathology that we, the experts, have to try to understand and unravel. And so here comes COVID, and it forced us to respect science, and it put scientists and public health officials in charge of our society, and they closed businesses, and we went through a year of on and off lockdowns, mask wearing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seemed it was too pat, as with all of these media, these grand media mistakes of the last couple of years. They always seem to be driven by these very pat little priors. I'm thinking of Russiagate here, where you had this enormous media insistence that Trump had colluded with the Russians. Look, I don't like Trump. I didn't vote for Trump. But what these people were looking for was a reason why their hero, Hillary Clinton, why she lost. They couldn't imagine it otherwise. So they had to invent this whole sort of, phantom of Russian cheating. And the same with this. Okay, so these things, they always fit these very pat little philosophies, and then upon investigation, they turn out to be true. I don't know how you come back from this one, though. If they get Russiagate wrong and then they get this wrong, this is just too much. This is too much. We're talking about the biggest catastrophe, the biggest global catastrophe in our lives. I mean, this is the biggest one since like World War II,
So on the subject of priors, I have a follow-up question, which is, obviously the lab leak theory, kind of gained traction among the right in the beginning, or it was sort of exclusively the domain of what you might call the populist right? Or like the kind of Trump crowd.
I wouldn't call it that, but yeah,
you
go
wouldn't
ahead.
call that.
I know what you mean.
I know you wouldn't. Okay, but among kind of the right wing, or among like the sort of Trump circle, or like the Trump media types, this was where the theory really began gaining traction. And I'm wondering why you think that was, because I think that the standard liberal explanation is like, oh, well, it was just racism, right? It was just a racist conspiracy theory. But here's the thing. We have seen that even if you believe that COVID was a natural phenomenon, and not created in a lab, it's still possible to be plenty racist about that fact, right?
Yes,
so I think, of course,
absolutely.
like, I'm sure there was anti-China sentiment. There was racism. Like, I don't doubt that, but I don't think it completely explains why this theory blew up on the right. And I'm wondering if you have any insight to that.
They do love conspiracies.
It's true.
Conspiracies simplify. Conspiracies make the world seem like good and evil. And so they're very, very attractive. Fox News deals in conspiracies. I've seen, as I've said before, members of my family go down that Fox News rabbit hole, and it sort of takes over the way they think about the world. Look, that sort of thing has always been very attractive to a certain kind of person. The world is very simple. What's funny is that our side also believed things that were ludicrously oversimplified, and very flattering to our heroes. And I'm just here to tell you that reality is always much more complicated than that. And blind faith in expertise is as dumb as blind faith in Fox News. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, Jen, but I'm doing my best here.
Yeah.
Well, look, part of the problem was just how politicized COVID was from the beginning. I mean, it was pretty clear from the jump that Donald Trump was trying to hide the fact that coronavirus was happening.
He bungled it completely.
This
is nothing that I've said. Nothing that I've said is to imply that I think he should be let off the hook.
Right.
I know that.
It was a disastrous presidency. On the other hand, if it hadn't been for that, he probably would have been reelected. This really did. This is what crashed the, I'm mixing metaphors here. The Trump train. What happens to trains? They crash, right? This is what derailed the Trump train was COVID and his incredibly poor, his awful response to it. Anyhow, we don't need to go into Trump here and his failures. We all know what they are. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. But the point that I was trying to get at was, you don't know who to trust, right? So in lieu of a trustworthy executive branch or trustworthy government, you find yourself looking for answers. And I think a lot of Americans were like, well, I mean, let's trust the scientists. They have the empirical data. But even in the science community, the American people, had to deal with a lie early on in regard to the use of masks. So can you talk about how that
there's that one, but there's something much worse going on here, which is, and look, I totally get what you're saying, because I'm that person too. Who do you believe when you want to understand reality? And especially when you can't verify it yourself, you're not an expert. And of course you trust, the media, and you trust scientific expertise. What's the point I was going to make? Darn it. I had it all worked out in my mind, Anna. And then,
the government, they shielded us from information.
Okay. There's the important thing to understand here about this is that if this turns out to be true, you are talking about, just absolutely demolishing these institutions that people had faith in. Absolutely destroying them, from the media to Facebook to the certain elements of the scientific community. And by the way, I'm not the first one to point this out. This is in the sort of the more scientific literature about this too. That if this turns out to be true, this is going to destroy the edifice of science for generations to come. Another thing is that there are huge conflicts of interest all over this issue. People that were supposed to be supervising, people that were supposed to be in charge, turned out they weren't doing their job for various reasons, usually because of conflicts of interest. There was a sort of notorious now a letter signed by a whole bunch of virologists in the Lancet magazine way back when this thing got going, and it now looks like that was put together by someone who would have been personally very embarrassed if the lab leak hypothesis turned out to be true, and so he organized this letter where they called it a conspiracy theory, and that's really where that whole narrative began. And in this sense, it's very similar to the financial crisis and to other sort of disastrous episodes before that. Whenever you're talking about the professional elite and what brings them down, there's two important things. One is conflicts of interest, and the other is groupthink. And you see both of these in high relief in this story. The groupthink where everybody agrees, they all come together. There's this enormous consensus. The consensus then it succeeds in stamping out dissent. That's what just happened. And that very same thing happened with the financial crisis. And then you also had the conflicts of interest all through the financial crisis, what the people that were supposed to be, again, the financial crisis is my sort of ultimate point of reference. But you think of all the people that were supposed to be regulating and supposed to be supervising and supposed to be, keeping this stuff in check, and all of them had been corrupted or bought off or conflicted in some way. This goes back. I also think of the Enron scandal, when remember they had succeeded in corrupting their accountant in this incredible way, so that the accountant would just let Enron do whatever the hell they wanted. There's these conflicts of interest just throughout this system, and then the liberals say, no, you just have to bow down to expertise. Right? That's the answer. It's just the simplest thing in the world. You just have to bow down to expertise. Well, it's the world is slightly more complicated than that. Expertise is not the answer to everything, even though we want to think that because we're members of the white collar class and we all went to college and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that our professors were so great and we want to trust them. Look, I am here to tell you, if this turns out to be true, we are at the very beginnings of a kind of enormous disillusionment with everything that I've just described, the professional elite, expertise, science, social media. These guys, if this turns out to be true and they were censoring it, these people need to be put out of business like tomorrow. This is disastrous, and what can you say about the Washington Post or the New York Times? This is inexcusable.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree that if this happened to be proven true, it would be a complete crisis of legitimacy for these institutions. But at the same time, as you pointed out in your piece, we have already seen so many. The U.S. has a very rich history, unfortunately, of elite abuses, of elite abuses and cover-ups. And not just Enron and the financial crash, as you were saying, although obviously those are some recent examples, but you could even say going back to the 60s and 70s, you got the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, COINTELPRO, and that's kind of when you start to see public trust in the government and the media and other institutions eroding. So,
and you're exactly right, Jen. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I was just going to ask, in light of all of that, my question is this just another drop in the bucket, or what about this makes it a new turning point, in your opinion?
It's the size of it. This is catastrophic. There's 3 million people have died worldwide, and the economy of the world this is much more disruptive than the financial crisis was. By the way, going back to Vietnam, you're exactly right. To this day, the best book on the subject of elite failure that I've now spent years writing about, I haven't even come close to it. It's a book called The Best and the Brightest, and it's basically about how the political science community dreamed up the Vietnam War, and it is absolutely this crushing book, but it describes, it anticipates how the public was turning against institutions in the way that you described. Well, I would say this one is different because it's much bigger. This is the worst thing that's happened in any of our lifetimes. Unless you can remember World War II, or the Great Depression. This is it. This is the worst, and there has to be accountability, because one of the details of this, a detail that I predict will soon be on everybody's lips if it turns out to be true, is the research in question is called gain of function research, where you take a virus from the animal world or from the human, whatever. You take a virus and you make it more virulent, you make it more deadly. And this is considered to be legitimate research. But it's not just something that they didn't invent this in Wuhan. This is being done in America. This is being done in Europe. This is being done all over the place. And lab leaks are also, again, this is not something specific to a singular lab in Wuhan, China. Lab leaks happen all the time. They happen with mathematical regularity, and people die from lab leaks all the time. People who are fooling around with bubonic plague or something like that in the lab, and oh, the mouse got loose or something. It happens all the time. And so when we do finally decide to have some accountability at the end of this, all of these things are going to be examined all over again. I mean, there has to be accountability for this. This cannot be permitted to happen again. But then, as you said, there's been a long series of these, and so we have some experience seeing how people react, and there is reason to believe that they will explain it away. I think of the financial crisis all the time, which was so absolutely wrenching and destructive for so many people, and nothing ever happened to those guys. The Wall Street bankers, they didn't even lose their jobs. This is the same crew. They're still there. Not only did they get bailed out, they didn't even get fired. Nothing ever happened to them. We sort of re-regulated them, right? Dodd-Frank, but that didn't, the Trump people came in and just trashed that immediately. So that, there you go. And you remember the things that they used to say? They would say, oh man, this was a perfect storm. There's no way anybody could have seen this coming. You can't hold us responsible for this. No one could have seen it, right? What was their phrase? Who could have known? Do you remember? I'm older than you guys. Anyhow, this was a big deal like 12 years ago. Who could have known? It was a perfect storm. And they did indeed. They were not held accountable. Accountability never happened to them. I mean, lots of ordinary people had their savings ruined. Not just in this country, but all over the world. I always think of those retirees in Dusseldorf where they were investing in these AAA Wall Street securities that turned out to be worth nothing. All these retirees, they lost everything. All over the world, people had their economies ruined. Some countries have still not come out of it properly, and no, there was never any accountability for those guys.
I mean, they were rewarded. They were rewarded.
Right. They're doing great. They're doing great.
They are. They bought up all the foreclosed homes. They manipulate the housing market. They became far more wealthy following that economic collapse. They were rewarded.
You remember there was exactly
the distrust in our institutions makes sense.
Yes. There you go. There you go. And this is the message of everything that I write for for the Democrats and for liberals. It's like, this makes sense. Okay, it's being expressed in a horribly wrong way, but it was easy to see Trump coming. It's not a perfect storm. It's not a who could have known. It was easy to see this sort of thing coming. And the thing is that the Democratic Party, the traditional party of the left in this country, such as it is, and I know it's not much of a left, right? But you, as the traditional party of the left, are the ones that are supposed to be out in front of this. When people don't trust institutions, you don't go and say, oh, well, there's something wrong with you for mistrusting institutions and experts. No, there's a really good reason for that. And the party of the left, should be out leading that, that attack on institutions and on expertise. But no, our politics are completely the other way around in this country. And I don't see where this ends. This is going to go on and on and on. Among other things, it's going to give, there's many other consequences. I'm just talking about the sort of intellectual ones that I can see on the horizon. It will give, it will breathe new life into the right wing, et cetera, et cetera. I think what is going to happen, because this is so damning for so many institutions, and so enormously consequential. And by the way, the blame you can't just say it all goes on China. We're done. That's not going to work. There's going to be lots of blame to go around. Like I said, for example, the social media companies, all of them should be gone tomorrow after this kind of performance. And but there's going to be there's going to be tons of blame to go around. And that's why I think they'll probably find that, that, oh man, we don't really know. We're never going to get to the bottom of it. Let's just forget about the whole thing. I think that's probably what'll happen. There never will be a proper inquiry or a proper, accountability for this. It's
Can
just
you talk a little
too
bit
devastating. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit more about the role of social media? Because I thought that was a really interesting piece of your article, and you touched on it already a little. But the funny thing about social media is that it was kind of sold to the public as like, this is a more democratic type of media, right? But how did that play out here?
I often, I wrote a book years ago in the year 2000 about the sort of cyber utopianism, the new economy. This is before social media, but it was the same kind of spirit. This idea that we had completely erased the barriers between people, high and low. We had collapsed the difference between high and low. Every hierarchy was down now, and et cetera, et cetera. It was ridiculous. And I was in 2015. I went to a Clinton Foundation presentation in New York City that I write about in Listen Liberal. And at it, it was Hillary Clinton herself made a presentation, and what's Bill Gates's wife? What is her name? Melinda Gates was there. She made a presentation, and various other figures like that. But one of the people who made a presentation, it was all about like social media, how it was empowering the lowly and the weak all over the world. It's just like this insanely optimistic, shout out to social media and what a great, anti-hierarchical force it was, how subversive it was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now, liberals scream and cry for social media to shut down their opponents. This is one of the weirdest, I'm 55 years old. I can remember when liberals were the free speech zealots, right? When the whole idea was to protect the speech even of, for God's sakes, Nazis,
like
right?
comedians,
And that was
like comedians saying insane things. I mean, I remember 2007 when all of these stories about right wingers wanting to censor comedians were being published.
Now it's us. Now it's our guys that want to do that,
It's
and
insane.
they want to. They had these a series of hearings where they would have Zuckerberg and whoever's in charge of Google and whoever's in charge of Twitter and et cetera. They'd have these people, they'd bring them to Washington, and the Democrats would pressure them to crack down on their political enemies. By the way, this is not me saying this. There has been, this a whole lot of literature about this. There is the Democratic Party more or less officially is demanding that Silicon Valley censor political speech by their opponents. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Sometimes I feel like I'm the last like 1970s liberal left, I'm the last one that thinks this is strange. But they were also doing it on COVID. They were demanding that the social media companies get tough with people spreading falsehoods about COVID. And this was one of them, the lab leak hypothesis. There's like I say, there's more than enough embarrassment to go around here. There are so many people are going to look stupid if this turns out to be true. So I think you guys see where this is going. It can't turn out to be true. It can't.
But the thing that also, like, I'm curious what you think about this, because I agree with you in that if the lab leak theory ends up being proven true, and by the way, we may never know. So there's that potential as well.
Yeah. We probably never will. Yeah. Go ahead.
There have been, as was already mentioned in this interview, like decades and decades of our institutions failing us. I remember, looking into why it is that the people of Denmark are able to accomplish these wonderful policies where they decommodify, parts of their private industry, like healthcare and all of that. Like, why can't we do that here in the United States? And one of the main factors is that Americans don't trust their government. They don't trust that their government can actually carry out these services and do it efficiently, do it well. So this problem in a lack of faith and trust in these institutions was already an issue, and it'll only be exacerbated if. So how does the left mitigate that?
Really good question,
because we're already in a giant hole. We're already in this giant hole as a result.
That's such a good question. I mean, can we go for another hour here?
I think we might
because
need to.
you've got one of the two political parties in this country that is basically dedicated to destroying government as an institution and proving that it can't do the job and proving that it can't work. I mean, they will do things like they'll deliberately throw a monkey wrench into some federal bureaucracy, and then they'll say, see, government, then they'll point to that very same bureaucracy and say, see, government can't work. Classic example being the people who were supposed to oversee the banking industry during the financial crisis. And it was, George W. Bush put hacks and cronies in charge. People didn't know what they were doing. There's many examples of this, but then they come back a couple of years later and say government can't do anything right. They let these guys get away with this stuff, and it's like, well, that was you did that, Republicans. This is I hate to tell you, I once wrote a book about this too. It was called The Wrecking Crew, and it's about a history of this kind of this conservative sort of sabotage of federal institutions. And it's no joke. I mean, the Reagan administration did this in all sorts of really dramatic ways. Well, the Nixon people sort of pioneered it, but George W. Bush took it to this kind of incredible, made it an art form. Like they turned the Department of Labor into the Department of Management, basically. I mean, they would flip entire federal bureaucracies on their head, run them in reverse. They were, it's incredible what they've done. And then they say, well, the government can't help you. Well, two things about this. First of all, in America, it's kind of a shame that this is what our political debates come down to, that, government helping you versus government not being able to help you. And that's a kind of legacy of the New Deal, which, by the way, the New Deal worked really well for about 40 or 50 years. And they eventually managed to bring everybody in, or they were trying to bring everybody in. And the Republicans gave up on opposing it. You have presidents like Eisenhower who did not repeal Social Security and went along with it. But then beginning in the 1970s, the Republicans figure out, wait a minute, we can undermine this thing and make our case in that way. And they did. And they've been very effective on that in that sense. But I want to remind you that there are other ways to achieve the kind of things that they have in Denmark that don't require, working through the state and having this state that's perfectly pristine. And the main one would be labor, organizing workers independently, and you can achieve a large degree of economic equality. Sorry, somebody's playing the stereo in the other room. I know you guys can't hear it, but it's very distracting. But there's look. It's an incredible dilemma. It's not an easy one to resolve. But the first thing that you have to do is you have to speak bluntly about it. You have to confront what's been happening. You have to tell the people about it. And the Democrats have been, and liberals in this country are extremely reluctant to do that. I mean, their faith in expertise, one of the pitfalls of this is that they have lost their faith in ordinary people. This is what I mean by anti-populism, that they have lost their faith in the sort of, the sort of old time left-wing faith that you could explain things to ordinary people. They would get it. The people were your ally. That's what being on the left was about. It's about ordinary Americans, but your modern day liberals don't believe that. They're like, put the power in the hands of the experts and bow down to them. Put the yard sign, respect science, and you're done and done. That's it. That's all you have to do. And I'm here to tell you that's not a great way to run a left.
One quick comment on Denmark.
Guys. I'm so sorry.
No, this is great. But one quick comment on Denmark, which is on my mind because earlier this week on the Jacobin channel, we had a big episode on social democracy. And when you look at the Nordic states, one of the reasons why their levels of trust in the government and other institutions is so high is basically because they have social democracy. They basically have institutions that work for them, that work for the people. And that kind of creates this like righteous cycle, right? And we have the opposite here, unfortunately, where as, elites kind of come to dominate these institutions and undermine them or completely dismantle them. Working class people kind of check out of the political process because they know that they don't really have any influence. But then that kind of feeds back into the political process where you have only elites who are involved in politics and continuing to craft these sort of anti-working class policies that, again, just disenfranchise more people. You know, I mean, there's not really a question there, I guess, but
but that's exactly right. And I'm sorry, I don't like talking about this because it's you start to realize the incredible fix that we're in, you know. And it is interesting about the Scandinavian countries. They don't have political parties that are dedicated to sabotaging the state. They don't have that, or if they do, those parties are really, really, really small. But in America, you know, and it's not a coincidence, we also had this very, very violent labor history in this country, where, you know, forming unions, which just seems like, you know, that's just okay in other countries, here was met with bullets, you know, armed guards. You know, it's the business elite in this country has fought so much harder, and you know, and with so much more effectiveness than in any other country. We could talk about this again for hours, but in some ways it's very depressing. So maybe we should change the subject. Let's talk about the death of the newspaper or something happy like that. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I did remember my question for you, and I don't know if it's like that much less nihilistic, but I guess I wonder if the lab leak theory is somehow like completely disproven, which, as you sort of alluded to earlier, would be like the best.
A sigh of relief if that happens.
Exactly.
But it's really scary if you think about it, Jen. This happened once. If this happened, and for the reasons that the various people that I quoted from and linked to in my article, for the reasons that they say it did, you know, that they were that these people were involved, were doing gain of function research. Well, we know that's going on all over the place, and we know that lab leaks happen, and we can almost predict mathematically that this will happen again. And that is really terrifying.
Right. So following from
back to what you were saying. Now back to your happy on what was
okay. So let's say the lab leak theory is like completely disproven, like beyond a shadow of a doubt. Like, I'm not sure how that will happen because, you know, as Anna was saying, like we probably will never know. But let's say that, like, best case scenario, it is disproven. I guess my fear is like, is it almost too late to put the genie back into the bottle at this point? Because it has become such a partisan issue, right? And like, to go back to what you were saying about Russiagate, that was disproven, but like Rachel Maddow still has her show. Like, liberals just kind of, I don't know, like swept it under the rug, you know, like there was no accountability, like you're saying. And the scary thing about conspiracy, right, is like when it's, quote, disproven, that sometimes just makes adherents double down even more. I don't know.
Excellent point. And I wasn't gonna, you know, look, I will be overjoyed if it is disproven, and they find the way it would be disproven is if they find the animal from which it, you know, or the species that it jumped from to humans. If they find that, then that will effectively disprove it. But short of that, I don't. Anyhow, I would be relieved if that happened, for reasons that I just made clear, that this is really, really, really frightening if it turns out to be true. You know, when I was a kid, and there were all of those movies about accidental nuclear war, but it never happened. You know, the safeguards pretty much worked, not perfectly, but pretty much. It never happened. Well, this just happened. You know, this is a disaster on a similar kind of scale, and it happened. And that is absolutely terrifying. And if we don't have accountability after this, and, you know, I don't know what to tell you about modern civilization, you know, but okay. Where were you going with that? You said, Jen, help me out here. I've already forgotten what you asked me because my mind is already racing off to a different subject. But you were saying, let's say, will it make the conspiracy theorists shut up? And the answer is no. Of course, it never will. But it'll make people like you and me, people who actually read things and think about things will be relieved and comforted. But you know, it's funny that you say that, because these conspiracy theories have a way of explaining their own failures. So the Russiagate people, basically, they look at the journalism that has disproving them, they're like, oh, those people are Russians. Those people are part of it. It's McCarthyism, right? Whenever anybody would stand up to Joe McCarthy, he'd be like, well, they must be part of the communist conspiracy. These things they always have a way of taking into account the people who disagree and sort of working them into the conspiracy. So no, it'll never, you're right. It'll never go away. Can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Well, everyone check out Thomas Frank's piece in The Guardian. It's titled, "If the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis is true, expect a political earthquake." Thomas, thank you so much for taking time to be here with us. And you've been incredibly generous with your time, and we really appreciate it.
What else am I going to do? We're here in lockdown, and yeah, it was my pleasure, guys.
Thanks, Thomas.
All right. Take care.